Hey. I think this worked. I got a dreaded playback error for a second there, but I think we're good. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to the dungeon of my office. I'm actually working on a new recording studio at home, so hopefully next week maybe we'll see, next week or in the next couple weeks, see something a little bit fancier in the background. I have some cool lights coming. I wanted to start today a bit different. I saw my friend Vladimir is here. He's one of the SymphonyCast people, so it's fun. We're going to talk about an internal tutorial creation tool that we have. Let me flip over here so I'm big. There we go. Vladimir also knows that we like to start our weekly meetings with, hold on a second. There we go. With a little bit of good news. So I'm going to open this up to everybody. I'm going to share a little bit of good news from me over the past week. I'm also going to share some funny things that we messed up over the past week. So if you have some good news to share about anything, personal, work, pop it into the chat. Let's celebrate. My first bit of good news is we finally went skiing. Yes. So this is Leanna, Beckett, and I on the top of the hill. We live near, many of you live near the Alps. So that's a real mountain. This is a hill, tiny hill near our house, but we're really lucky to have it. So we finally got snow and it finally opened. So this is us skiing. We also, not pictured here, I would love to have had video of this. We got basically eaten by the chairlift. So it's kind of hard to describe, but if you've skied before, we got up to the spot where we were supposed to be, but we are off-centered. So if you think like this is the chair right here, I need a third hand. I ended up being in the middle. Beckett was right here, and then we kind of pushed Leanna off the side. And so when it came to scoop us up, it knocked her over, knocked Beckett over, basically like ate all of us, and then I got on just fine. So I was cool, but it was actually really funny. We got effectively flattened under the chairlift, but everybody was fine. So it was a good time, good opportunity to laugh at ourselves. Let's see, what other good news? I'm checking the chat right here. Hello, everyone. Lots of good waves. Share some good news in there if you have it. Other good news, technical-wise, this is just a little, I have to celebrate this because it was a big pain in the butt. I fixed 3 complex bugs last week in autocomplete and live components. I'm not going to go into the details because they are really technical, but previously there was some incompatibility between live components and autocomplete. Live components behind the scenes uses a library called TomSelect, which I chose because it's sort of an industry standard, and on the surface, it's really cool. It works really well. I have learned that the internals of this library are kind of insane, and so it was very difficult to get it to play well with morphing, which is something we talked about last week. So anyways, this should work now in the next release. This was fixed. It was something I was working on for a long time. Finally figured out how to make it work correctly, normally. Life is good. Another thing that TomSelect does is in our stimulus controllers, we are supposed to disconnect things. So let's actually, I'll open this up and show you. So right in a stimulus controller, if you do some setup, then you're supposed to undo that setup inside of disconnect. So in the autocomplete controller, which is what this is, since we create a TomSelect instance inside of our connect method, we should destroy it inside of disconnect. And in fact, we do right there. The complicated thing, again, TomSelect is just weird. What TomSelect does when it first starts up, TomSelect grabs what your options look like at that moment. And then when you destroy it, it actually reverts your options to their original state. So the problem with this is that if you have since selected an option, when you destroy TomSelect, it reverts all the HTML back to its original state, and you lose your selected option. So it was an edge case thing, but some people were getting hit by this where their autocomplete was being moved on the page, and that caused the stimulus controller to disconnect and reconnect, which is fine. But when it moved and disconnected and reconnected, TomSelect would revert the HTML and then reinitialize itself once again on the original HTML, and we lose the selected value. So, and the last one here is a really, if maybe you've seen this before, there was a super edge case where you could have let me back up here. With live components, if you do two things really quickly, and that causes two AJAX requests. So for example, let's say you type into a box, you have two boxes, you type into a box really quickly, and then you really quickly hit a submit button down here. So that should trigger two AJAX requests, one to update the model on this box, and another one to trigger, for example, a live action that you have on that submit button. And they're made to wait for each other. We don't want them to happen at the same time because you can get weird race conditions. We need to wait for the first AJAX call to finish to update the state, update the data from this field. And then after that finishes, we need to click this submit button and have it submit with the latest data. There was a crazy edge case, a very, very small window where if you clicked this at just the right moment, it could send the second AJAX request just a little bit early. And that would mean that this AJAX request would be sent without the new thing that you just typed into this box. And so people were submitting their forms and they'd be missing a value that had just been added. It was really, really hard to repeat because it's a really small window, but we finally figured that out and crushed that. All right. Ooh, good news here. Got my first AWS certification. Congratulations, AWS. I feel like that is something that you need to have your PhD in, especially if you've ever messed with, what do they call them? The permission system, which is a big JSON document, right? I've messed with those a little bit. Not even enough to remember what they're called, but those are tough. So yeah, awesome, man. That is really good news. Congratulations. All right, enough talking about that. I do want to admit two things that we did poorly in the past week. You may have seen we managed to send on the same day a newsletter with no subject line. So we have now accomplished that. We're spinning it as a way to increase click-through rates because we had lots of people that did click through because they wanted to see if we made any more mistakes inside the email. So we did that, and we also took our site down yesterday morning because we have, as Vladimir knows, not enough and too much caching, if that makes sense. So this is on Symfony casts. We have multiple layers of cache, and they're so confusing that if you have to reset the cache on one of them, you might not really understand what's happening. So our site was down-ish for about an hour yesterday. You know, you'll learn. But now we have a better plan for how to properly fix those caching systems. And I'm using a lot more HTTP caching lately just because it's really fast. So for example, on our new design, and I apologize if I'm just wandering here. That's part of the point of these live streams. We can talk about whatever. We can start with the plan, then talk about whatever. But for example, we just added HTTP caching to this sidebar because this is quite long and there's quite a lot of data to load. So this is now HTTP cached over here, which is cool. And then there's a little trick here. You see I have a check mark on this. That's because I've watched this video. So the tricky thing about the HTTP caching is that it can't really be user specific. I need to have one HTTP cached version of this chapter list for my entire site. So you can't really do that with the check mark right there. So the workaround was to HTTP cache this. And then this is wrapped in a turbo frame. So as soon as the HTTP cached version loads on the page, the turbo frame triggers an AJAX request to load the user version of this page. So I think if you watch closely here, when the page first loads, you'll see no check mark there. Let's see if we can spot it. Yep, there we go. And the 13% was also gone. So it loads really, really quickly on page load. And then we're able to send that AJAX request to fetch your heavier user-specific version that shows which chapters you've actually finished. So that was kind of a cool little hack that we got there. Peter asked what the layers we're using on top. We are just using, even though you're not supposed to, but I think that you should, we're just using Symfony's app cache. So we're not using Varnish. It's too complicated. I just don't care. So we are using the app cache, Symfony's app cache, to actually do our caching instead of Varnish. It works great. The only tricky thing is not invalidation, because we don't really need invalidation. So the way that we invalidate this cache is that when we use the render ESI from Symfony, where are we here? There we go. So when you use HTTP cache, you use this render ESI, and then you point it at a controller. And then anything that you pass here, these become arguments to that controller. But also anything that you pass here effectively becomes part of your cache key. So in this case, if you rendered this on the page in one spot with max per page 5, and then you decided that you wanted to show 10 per page, and so you changed this to 10 and deployed, that would naturally have a new cache key, so you wouldn't need to worry about any cache invalidation. So what we do on the sidebar here is we have a course entity, and that course entity, very simple, has a last updated at date column. And we just make sure that anything that would go into this sidebar, so these chapter titles, the challenges we have here, we just make sure that they all update that course last updated by. So that's actually last updated at. That's really the most complex part of the entire caching system, is making sure that if you update the title of a chapter, or if you add a new challenge, all of those change that last updated at field, so that instantly we get a new version of the cache over here. So anyway, the only problem with Symfony's app cache, Symfony's app cache, it stores all the cache files just in your var directory. So the only problem is that it never clears the old ones, so you need to watch out to make sure your hard drive doesn't fill up. It'll just keep creating new cached files over time as needed, but it never cleans up the old ones, so you could, in theory, eventually run out of hard drive space. But other than that, it works super great, and I'm a big fan of having a smaller, more understandable stack and not having to introduce varnish just to have something cool like HTTP caching. And our next thing that we're going to HTTP cache are the comments down here, because these also, if we get 20 or 25 comments, these actually are quite slow and also really static, right? We don't need to be loading these dynamically every single time. So anyway, yeah, that's it. So there's my good news, there's my bad news, and let's dive into stuff. So I have a little list here. And as always, if you have questions about anything, we can take this in any direction we want. In fact, apologies if you are really excited to see the tutorial tool, but I did want to talk about, or really ask all of you about one other thing first, then we will look at that tool. And it has to do with Twig components. Let's see here. Twig components and about the attributes system. Cool. So let me just copy this and let's do a little bit of playing around over here. No, actually, let's put this in a proper editor. Oh, by the way, this is code. This is the work in progress pull request for what we talked about last week. So if you're here for last week, that pull request is not done yet, but it will be done really soon. I was working on it last night. All right, let's open a template. I don't care what. Perfect, whatever. All right, so what I want to talk about, or ask all of us about, do some brainstorming here, is this attributes variable that we have. So the idea is, let's pretend this is an alert component, right? I could pass class equals something, and I don't know, role equals something else into that, and this class something and this role something, they're going to go into this attributes. So when we print the attributes, if we just printed them like that, that would end up with a class equals something and role equals something else attributes. Those would actually get put onto here like this. So it's one of my favorite features of Twig components. And as many of you probably know, if you have any default things that you want to put on there, then we have this defaults method that you can call, so you can specify what your default class is, for example. There are a couple of things that are problematic with this, or not ideal, and that's what I want to talk about. Number one is And let's see, I'll keep Copilot on, even though it's annoying sometimes. Number one is, if I pass, should attributes override or append? So in this case, if I've class something here and I've class alert type right there, what's the behavior? Does this class something override this, or do I end up with alert type? Let me make that even simpler. And something. Does it print all three classes, or does it print just one of them? Well, I'll tell you right now. Class is a merge. And data controller is a merge. So if you had a stimulus controller and you wanted to attach that like that, and we had another one up here, those would merge on top of each other. So data-controller equals foobar. There we go. So you end up, in this case, it would actually merge those, and you would get data-controller foobar alert. So it kind of understands the format and it appends them to each other. But I think these are hard-coded. I think data action's another one that merges. These three are special cases that are hard-coded into the components attributes system. So you can see it's just something we decided because it's probably the behavior we want, but there's no way to control it. And there probably should be a way to control it, to say I want to override, or I want to prepend, or I want to append to it. So that's kind of problem number one. Problem number two, if you want to call it a problem, is I want attributes to feel as natural as possible. And the trick here is that when you are rendering a twig component, if you're using the HTML syntax, then you can just treat it like an HTML element, right? I can just say class equals something. This looks like an HTML element. It isn't a valid HTML element. But when we're in our components, you suddenly have to use twig code to render the attributes. Not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. When I see Leanna, my front-end designer, do this, I kind of cringe a little bit because we've done such a good job letting her just use normal HTML code there, and then suddenly, oh, I need to explain this twig-specific syntax right there. So that's kind of problem number two. And problem number three, which is probably just an internal thing, need the ability to hook into the attributes. This is maybe not a problem with the syntax, but it's probably the biggest shortcoming right now of attributes. If you're using Tailwind, we have this problem where you'll have a bunch of classes right here. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Copilot. You have a bunch of classes by default, right? You have an alert, and you say that you want the alert to be background red, life is good. And then when you render it, you say, you know what? In this case, we're going to make the border red 700. So that's just a slightly different color of red. So what's going to happen right now is not surprising. It's going to output as this. Okay, so we get the border red 700 in front, and then we have all the defaults afterwards. Who can tell me what will happen here? Is border red 700 going to win, or is border red 500 going to win, or is my computer going to catch on fire and throw itself out the window? Do live audience testing. There's a slight delay between my recording and you all hearing it too, which is kind of annoying for talking, but border red 500 wins. Oh, Kevin said small thing, but border red 700. I love this. It's going to be at the end of the class. That probably changes Tarmo's answer. I'm going to leave it right there, though. Depends on the order of the CSS classes are defined in the generated style sheet. Yes. So Everett and Peter, I probably would have said, actually, a couple months ago, Tarmo, I would have said what you would have said. I would have said that there's something with the ordering of these, right? Like this one comes first, so maybe the first one wins, maybe the last one wins. It actually turns out none of that. That's not how it works at all. There's nothing in the HTML spec that defines the behavior for the order of classes inside the class attribute. So there's no difference between me having this here versus having it there. The order of these classes inside here makes no difference at all. It is entirely determined by the CSS file behind the scenes and what order it generates things in. And what order does it generate things in? We don't know. And we don't care. Tailwind is generating it for us. And Tailwind doesn't guarantee us any order. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to have red 500 or red 700. It's just going to generate them in whatever order it found them in your project. So this is actually, in Tailwind land, considered invalid code. You are not supposed to have two competing classes on a element. Fun example of this from Peter is Tailwind padding. What does the left edge have with PX-5 and PL-2? Yikes, yeah. So this is probably the biggest gotcha that I've found with Tailwind. Fortunately, there is a way to fix this. There's a PHP library called Tailwind Merge. And there is even a bundle for Tailwind Merge. And let's see if I can remember where it is. Is it made by... there we go. It's Tales from a Dev. Same person that makes the Flowit bundle makes a Twig Tailwind Extra. And it's, if I go to usage, oh, actually, it showed it right there. It's Tailwind Merge, right? So you can take your classes, you can pop Tailwind Merge on it, and it has intelligence to understand that two classes will interact with each other, and it does define this idea of whatever class comes second will win. So that's why this one wins here, and that's why this one wins here. Anyway, long explanation to say that when we are outputting the attributes, when the attributes finally do get printed, so this attributes is actually an object, and it has a toString method, and the toString method just outputs all of the attributes and all of the attribute values. So I don't really want to, I don't even want to have the user, like we could somehow try to make something like this work. That doesn't really even make sense, but hopefully you get the idea. But I don't even want that. My thinking is if you have that Tailwind library installed, this is something that should automatically happen inside the attributes. When you print the attributes, there's a hook inside there so that it can run it automatically through Tailwind Merge, and it just works without you needing to think about it. It's just something that if you're using Tailwind and you have that library, it should just always work. So that's kind of the third problem down there. So anyway, this is a long explanation for really the problem. And what I want to think about is what is the dream syntax to print those attributes? And I don't know. And also, what's the dream syntax for maybe rendering them? You know, is there some special syntax we use for overriding versus appending? So, for example, I mean, I don't know. This is I don't really like this, but do you do something like that? Let's see. Vladimir says, what if you have curly brace attributes class equals, and then data controller end attributes? Tell me more about that, Vladimir. I see it's an attributes tag, and then we specify the class. Yeah, Vladimir, give me more details on that. That's the kind of thinking that I want, though. We need something different here. Oh, I see what you're saying, Vladimir. You're saying what if, because that would give us the HTML syntax again. Ah, so just thinking of how can we make the syntax friendlier. Ah, okay. So we have let's see here. So it feels a little bit weird, but it shouldn't. Effectively something like that. That is interesting. Because, yeah, look at that. I'm getting, as Vladimir said, I'm getting auto-completion on that. Data as controller. Yeah, it's going to give me everything I want. Class equals, well, this attributes thing is a little bit bulky, but I don't hate this. Let's see, I'm getting an error here. Closing, oh, of course. Haha, that would make it better. Wait, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. See, I'm confusing myself with this. Kevin said maybe a core attributes component that can be used to set defaults at the top of a component file, kind of like props. That's an interesting idea. So when we're thinking about the syntax here, in my mind, I've been thinking about the fact that the best syntax here might be an HTML syntax like Kevin was just showing. But I've been thinking in my head, let's first try to define a syntax with pure twig code, like this attributes thing that Vladimir was talking about. And then if we can get something that is pretty good with the twig code, then we could brainstorm what would be an optional HTML way of doing things. Because as a reminder, like we have this cool twig syntax, but that cool twig syntax is just that. It's just something that rewrites to this internally. So let's see. Kevin said, I would go with a modifier for each attribute inside the component. The default is merge or replace, and a modifier for each one. Would be good to think about what front-end component libraries do. Yes, I often try to look at what other, like Vue and React. So for example, with Vue, I would expect what I pass into replace unless I wrote the component specifically to merge values. So what would be a proposal for what that syntax would look like to merge values? And Kevin, on your suggestion, do you have a non-HTML version of what you're talking about? And I don't know if we need an attribute component. I liked what you're talking about with props, like potentially an attributes tag, where you're able to define things. So what Kevin's talking about with the props is, at the top of your file, you can do something like this at the top of your components. And then this means when you actually call this component, you can do something like this, and type is going to be seen as a variable instead of an attribute that will be printed. So there could be some sort of system up here for defining those. Maybe at least defining the merge behavior. Though I like Vladimir's idea still, this doing something down here like this allows us, again, to get the auto completion because our editor sees that we are inside of a div tag. Peter, attributes.defaults, class, merge. That's interesting. Yeah, I do like Vladimir's idea for auto completion. I'm struggling with this giant attributes thing here, which I don't love. But I feel like maybe that's something we could get used to or maybe iterate on this idea a little bit. Peter, I like your idea of defining the merge. What I don't like about it is it still sticks us in this situation of writing twig code. But I feel like we're closer. So what Peter is saying, and the details here are not really that important, but something like this, right? That wouldn't be exactly what we would do because this would mean we would have a global twig function called merge, which doesn't make sense. But this is the idea, yeah, somehow defining the syntax you want. It almost it's funny, it reminds me of blocks, right? Almost doing something like this. Again, that's not an actual syntax that I'm proposing, all right? But we could do... again, I don't love this, but for the sake of just trying things, right? So it's like get the current ones and then output the ones that were passed in by the user. Kevin said, Peter, I found that you want to define the merge, append, prepend behavior when rendering the component, not in the component itself. But that's just my experience. Yeah, that's an interesting point. You might have a situation where you are using a component, and in that case, you want to just add a couple extra classes. And then in other situations, you use that same components and you actually want to replace the classes. You see, yeah, it gets tricky. Like in theory, and I don't want to go this far down the rabbit hole, but in theory, you could have a situation where you want to replace some of the classes, right? In theory, you could be like, okay, here's these core classes that should always be there, but in this case, I want to replace just these sets of classes, and that's probably impossible. It's probably outside of the scope. You'd probably need to actually pass in a prop for that, like a variable, and then have some conditional logic based on that variable. So that's probably outside the scope of what we're looking at. Okay, interesting. I think we can leave this right here. This is going to give me some things to think about, especially, well, really both Peter and Vladimir's idea, especially with this attribute syntax. But yeah, I need to think about that more. That's really interesting. You know, the nice thing about a tag, which is the curly brace % stuff, is that we can really do whatever crazy syntax we want inside, because whatever syntax is inside is like we can capture that and do whatever we want with it. So that's a really powerful idea. All right, any other thoughts, ideas on this problem? I guess another thing I had thought about, but I really don't love this, is like this, because what I'm getting at is, and this is really what the core of Vladimir's idea is, trying to do something inside of here so that we can have Twig capture our attributes. So we can write our attributes in a normal way, but Twig can capture them so then we can do something with them. Like we can grab the class attribute in between here and parse this, and then, you know, add whatever custom class the user's passing to the end of this. So we need to be able to parse this in PHP and do something custom with it. So the problem is that normally if you just have a div, it just looks like a normal div. Twig's not going to parse that. So, you know, I had thought also about, what if on the root components you prefix it with twig : and then that hits our normal lexing system, and then we are able to parse this. It looks weird because it looks like a Twig component, and I don't want to create Twig components or have some system in Twig components to render divs and LIs and everything. Like, that sounds crazy. But I don't know. I mean, maybe we do allow that. Maybe this is the HTML version of this idea. Maybe this is actually what happens behind the scenes, and this is the optional HTML version of that. I'm not sure. So anyway, let's leave that there. This is food for thought. This is I feel like this is a lot closer, and I've already burned half of our time, and I really want to get into that tutorial stuff a little bit. So let me check my notes here, make sure I'm not skipping over anything. Cool. All right, so you know. Oh yeah, Kevin, to clarify, curly attributes would be a replacement for curly.defaults. I think basically yes. It would. So what this syntax fixes is not the merging prepending problem, at least not yet. It would be fixing the fact that we're not writing real HTML for the attribute.defaults, which would be kind of nice. I mean, I would love to just be able to do data controller. So yes. All right, so let's get to this tutorial tool. Let me close this down here. And first, I'm going to give you a quick tour into what version 1 of this tool looks like. So, and I love this tool. This tool is probably 10 years old. I use it for every tutorial. I use it for every workshop I do. And what it does is it helps us build the code for a tutorial. So before I hit record, we build the whole tutorial exhaustively, and we try to make every step as smooth as possible. And you can imagine how you might do this conceptually. If you're thinking about building a project, and that project might be 20 steps, right? Step one, we're going to create a controller, and then we're going to render a template, and then we're going to make this change to the template. So you break things down into as small of pieces as possible so you can have these micro steps. And if you are just building a project and you're making a commit for every micro step, you can instantly see what the problem is going to be. You're going to make 5 clean commits and then go, oh crap, I really wish that on step 3 we had named the variable differently. And you can't really go back to step 3. You can't go back 2 commits and make a change very easily. And then if you do make the change on step 3, you need to merge that up to step 4 and merge it up to step 5. So there's a good chance that you're now thinking that's what Git branches do. And in fact, you see that a decent bit on the internet. People will create 1 branch per step. And that's actually a really nice way of doing things. So we have 1 branch for step 1, 1 for step 2, 1 for step 3, 1 for step 4. And so if you did make a mistake on step 3, in theory, you could go backwards to step 3, make that change, and then the only annoying part is you would need to then merge step 3 into step 4, and then merge step 4, the branch for step 4, into step 5. So sometimes our tutorials are, I'll actually show you last stack, 216 steps. Yikes. So good luck merging 216 times every time you need to make a change. That's not the world that I want to live in. But this branch approach is the correct approach because Git is really good at doing these merging. So what our current tool, it's called TutsHero. And you'll see me run it with an alias called TH for standing for TutsHero. What it does is it just automates that process for us. So it does allow us to create steps. And when we create those steps, it is creating a new branch behind the scenes. So for example, as you can see here, we have 216 steps. And I can move, TutsHero move. Let's move to, actually, I have a bunch of alias shortcuts. I'm going to try not to move. Let's move to step 208. And what it did behind the scenes is it just checked me out to that branch. And then if I do a tuts move back to step 212, you can see that took a little bit longer because it actually moved every branch one by one, merging the previous branch into it. So it's actually keeping track. Watch, check out all these branches here. Yikes. Yeah, we have 216 branches. It's actually keeping track of all of the branch names and then merging them automatically for me. So that's really like the root of what the tool does. But the second problem is, okay, I have 216 branches. Now what? How do I push that up to a repository and save that somewhere? Because all of our code, let's see, 30 days. All of our code lives up on GitHub. So the main branch actually represents the starting code. So in this system right now, we'd have to push the main branch, and then we'd also have to push 216 other branches. And that's possible. I just didn't want to do that. I just thought this is not a good way of doing things. It didn't feel right to me. So the second part of the tool is that is that you can, when you're finished doing your work, you can run a command called tuts compile. Tuts compile. Oops, and it's going to yell at me because apparently I've been messing around with this repository. Tuts compile, and you give it a commit message. Compiling changes on a live stream. There's not going to be any changes to compile here, but what it does, it actually calculates the diff that happens between each branch. So in this case, there's going to be 216 diffs, and it ultimately saves those just as files on the main branch. So I'll show you here in a second. Yeah, it says, looks like there was nothing to commit. But if we look, there's a _tuts branch, and it has 216 diff files. And that's it. It's 216 diff files, and it also has a steps.json file that lists those 216 steps and what the key of each of them is. So this is what maintains the order. So at this point, if I run git branch, actually let me run tuts reset. Tuts reset is something that will delete all of my branches. So the branches are actually not important at all. The branches are something that you need while you're working, but you don't actually need them afterwards. So everything is stored in the diff file. So in this case, if I run tuts move, and let's say we want to move just to step 10, at that moment, it's going to see that it's missing a branch for step 2, and it's going to create the branch for step 2. It's going to use the diff file to patch it, and so on and so forth. So at that moment, it actually created all 10 of those branches. And that's really it. It's relatively simple. It's really, really powerful because we can create these tutorials. We can go backwards in time, change things, move forward. If we go backwards and we change a file and it creates a conflict, then guess what? It just stops, and it's a git conflict. It's a normal git merge conflict. So you fix it like you would with any normal merge conflict. You commit it, and then you keep moving. So it works really well. Anyway, this is V1 of the tool. And right now we're working on version 2 of this tool, which is the code you see here. And the biggest change is that instead of storing the diffs inside of a tuts directory like this, I want to store them directly inside of the source code. So something else that we do in our tutorials is the scripts themselves live just as MD files inside of an sfcast directory. So here we go. Actually, that's a good one. Yeah, there we go. And so when we're building the tutorial, we start by sort of writing a rough outline for what we want to do inside of here. And then eventually it becomes this final copy. And what I would like to do is when we're writing that rough outline, I actually want the diffs to be right inside of here. So this sounds a little bit crazy, and there's a whole other UI part of this that I'm not going to talk about right now. But ultimately what it means is that when we run our compile from TutsHero, I don't want all of those diffs to go into a bunch of diff files. I actually want them to go right into where they're supposed to go inside of these MD files. So another thing, you can see this like weird code thing here. This is actually what causes our magic code blocks to show up on the site right here. So this little git ignore right there, that is actually tied to this file, right? This little thing right here. So when we publish the tutorial, the team, Vladimir actually does this, goes in, looks at the tutorial, sees what code we're supposed to be showing right here, and actually creates an internal code block where Vladimir basically goes and uses TutsHero to find the correct step that we're working on right now. For example, asset mapper, or probably this step right here, because we just installed asset mapper, and this is the git ignore file. So he basically tells the system, I want to create a code block at this step, and I want to show the .git ignore file. So we actually have to do that manually, and then it gives us a little ID that we stick inside of here. So I don't want to do that anymore. 2024 is about doing things more efficiently. I want TutsHero to just embed the diff file right inside of here so that things work. Things I can iterate faster because everything's going to be kind of in one spot. So we have after all that, about 15 minutes left here. So I'm just going to work a little bit inside of here and talk about what I'm doing. One of the more interesting things about this project is that the tests are almost entirely in Behat, which is really cool. I've always been attracted to using Behat to test terminal tools because it's kind of fun to think about your terminal tool as a user interface. So right now I'm working inside of a feature file called branch building. And the job of this feature file is to basically verify the behavior that as we move from steps, it's creating new branches behind the scenes. So I've just kind of ripped open a bunch of code inside of here. So I am basically running the tests and trying to fix everything. So actually I have this first scenario working already to prove it and actually make sure I haven't broken it. Let's just rerun line 6 right here. So let's see. I don't need to be in here anymore. Here's my code. So vendor ben Behat, and we're going to test features branch building. Hello. Yeah, I actually remember that now. This is the weirdest thing. I'm just with vendor bin Behat. I'm not getting my autocomplete at my files, which is really frustrating. All right, and then we are going to run just scenario on line 6. So I'm going to do a little :6 right there. Oh, and I did break something, didn't I? Ooh, all right, let's go see that. Okay, so undefined array key file name in feature context line 422. Oh, because I tripped over my keyboard a second ago. There we go. One of the other things I love is the integration with PHP Storm. The fact that if I want to jump to the code behind this, I can just hold Command and then pop right to the Behat definition for this thing. And I just love how expressive that is. Okay, given the project has the following files in it, so I'm going to start a project with file name start1 and file name start2, and I don't care what the contents are inside of here. So this just loops over those, grabs the file name, gives me some random contents, and then have a little git wrapper tool, which is going to add those files and commit them. So you can see it's just very straightforward. It's doing what we expect it to do. It's kind of acting as a user. So let's try this again. Okay, cool. So this one does pass. So this shows you the base functionality here. So given we have these files and the following chapters exist. So this is a new thing with version 2, where we're going to have chapters that live inside of an sfcast directory. And then I say, and chapter 1 has code blocks with diffs built from the following change set. So we're assuming in this case that we already have an MD file, and it already has a couple of diffs kind of inside of it. So this is a shortcut to basically say, okay, we're going to have, imagine we start with the foo.txt, which has these contents, and a bar.txt, which has these contents. So this is going to form the first diff that shows up inside of that MD file. So you can imagine a diff, instead of a code thing showing up right here, it's actually like literally a GitHub diff code block, which would show us adding these two files. And then see, this is step 2. So we went from step 1 and step 1 to step 2. And step 2, we've changed foo.txt, we've changed its contents. So we can imagine down here, we have another code block that is going to contain just the diff for changing that second file. So it's going to have, minus this contents and plus this contents. So given we already start the project with that, this is entirely in our given right here. When I run tuts move last, which is a shortcut to move to the last step that we have available, the last code block we have available, then I should be on this branch. So we're just verifying that the branches are being created behind the scenes and we're being moved correctly. Now this looks a little bit funny. We're doing some weird wildcard stuff in here. Default branch name is a wildcard that actually gets filled in by this step, and that's going to be, I think, the master branch. So this is effectively just master. I just didn't want to hard code that. And then over here, this is a little bit tricky because what we want is we know that internally TutsHero is going to need to create branches for each of the code blocks, which I'm calling step. This is kind of code block 1. Step 1 is code block 1, and step 2 is code block 2. But we don't know what they're going to be called. We don't really care. They could call them whatever they want. It could be a random string. We just know that there should be a distinct branch name for this code block and a distinct branch name for this code block. So when I'm asserting the branch, I kind of also had to create a little alias system. So alias : step 2 is a little wildcard that is going to look up, hey, what is the branch name that was assigned with this diff, and make sure that we're in kind of replace that branch. So it checks that we're on there, and then it checks that the foo.txt file should actually contain step 1 content changed. So that should actually represent this changed line here, because we moved to the last step. The last step, which is step 2, should have that. And then, of course, bar.txt is a little simpler. It should just contain some file. And then same down here, we are, the following step should exist. So we're verifying that if we look at all of the steps, all of the diffs, so I call them steps, all the diffs, then we just have those 2 steps. So that's kind of like the first passing test to kind of get the base of everything working. Let me take a drink here. And if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. I don't know if this is even making sense. This is something I've been thinking about for 10 years. So I'm just hopping in and being like, okay, here's a expert level class on 10 years of thinking about creating tutorials and dreaming about creating tutorials and thinking about them in the shower and all that kind of stuff. So the second scenario here, this is the one that's failing, is rebuilding branches that includes deleted files are committed correctly. Yeah, so actually, if we read this, it makes a lot of sense. So given tuts has been initialized on the master branch. So this actually has a different meaning right now than it did before. But what it is effectively doing, I'm not sure I even need this anymore. It was needed in version 1. Is it's just making sure that I am on a specific branch to start. So you can see it's just setting this as the branch name and moving me to that branch. I don't know if that's actually needed. I might delete that, but we'll leave it now. Then when I run tuts create step 1, so I didn't show creating steps, but when you want to create a step, that's currently how you do it, or at least how you did it in version 1. And then we're going to create a file with some content, create another file with some content, create a step 2, so move forward, and then delete bar.txt, and then go to step 3, do some changes, and then kind of goes on from there. So we're actually end up doing, a compile, and then moving back to step 3. And what we're basically checking here is because we deleted bar.txt, step 2 should actually fully delete that file. We should be able to kind of rebuild. And when we get to step 2, that file should actually be completely gone, not just empty or something, but actually completely gone. So if we run this one, this is actually, I know this is failing because this is where I left off. And this is early in the refactoring, so we're going to hit all kinds of crazy problems. It says your Tuts project is not initialized, coming from somewhere. And this is when we ran tuts create step 1. This is an error. I recognize this error from my code. You used to have to run a tuts init command to kind of create some files for you. I actually deleted that command. I don't think we need it anymore, but I still have some code that's looking for it. So to get a stack trace, I'm going to run this with a -v, or maybe it's -vvv. There we go. And let's see here. It's coming from, is that right? Hold on a second. It's coming from process context line 27. Is that right? What part of my code is it coming from? That's what I want to know. Well, let me look at process context line 27. So I have a few, if you're familiar with Behat, I have 3 context files that are kind of organized into what each of them does. Okay, so when I run the command, okay, that actually makes sense. Okay, yeah. So when I run the command, I'm running tuts create step 1. It's actually giving me this error here. So things are so broken right now that we're going to shortcut things a little bit. And I'm going to do a DD here of this arrow get path. So behind the scenes, when we run these tests, it creates a directory inside of a temporary directory. And it actually really is initializing a Git repository there and committing files to that directory. So I found it useful when things are totally broken like this to just go in there and play around with stuff. So if I rerun this test now, it's going to show me, yeah, here's where we created your Git directory. Let's pop that open in a new tab. And there we go. You can see I'm on, oh, interesting. I'm on branch 1.x. So even this, oh, because never mind. I did my DD before I did my move to branch. That's fine. So this is where I can kind of play around with stuff and say, okay, tuts create step 1. And I'm going to get your project is not initialized. So let's actually look and see where that's coming from. Oh, my bad. I have to be careful. Tuts is my binary for version 1. So I need to be a little bit more verbose with this so I can actually get my version 2. Tuts move, or tuts create step 1. That'll give me that error. Why can I not get the verbose on that? I might have to look at that later. Oh yeah, that's actually a good point. For active development step, it will be much more useful to move this temporary directory inside the var. That is actually a good idea. And if we did cleanup before every scenario, then we wouldn't even need multiple temporary directories. So yeah, that's a good point. Instead of having like an actual temporary directory, just having this like inside of a var directory inside of here, so you can just always go into there and grab it. I like that suggestion. By the way, this is not even a Symfony project. This is so old, it's actually just a bunch of Symfony components with a dependency injection container that uses Pimple, if you remember that. So it's a little low level. That's why I think I probably have something misconfigured with the verbosity on here, which is a bummer. So we'll have to go the old school way to figure out where this is coming from. Well, there's no verbose message here, but because we're throwing an exception, I think we're throwing an exception. Oh, there is no exception. Come on, Ryan, what are you doing? I see what you're saying, Vladimir. There we go. So I was actually checking this internal configuration file exists, and I assume that was an exception. That's why I was trying to get a stack trace. There's no exception at all. Let me just remove this because as I mentioned, I don't think we actually need this anymore. Yeah, I'm going to remove this for now, and we're going to see what happens. Still wrapping my head around the changes needed for this. Before, running tuts create was really simple because it just created a new branch, right? That's all it did, just created a new branch based off the current branch. It was effectively the same as doing git checkout -b step 1. It would just check out, assuming if you were on step 50 and you created a new branch off of step 50, that would become step 51. So that's effectively what this used to do. Things are a little more complicated now because we need to know what chapter this step is going to live in, because ultimately when we compile them, we need to put them into the correct chapter. So I'm not even sure that running create step 1 makes sense anymore. We may need to do something where we are specifying both the step name and also the chapter name. And then maybe even the position inside of there. Because sometimes we might be creating well, actually, think about, no, that actually should be fine. Never mind. I was thinking if we're creating a new chapter, if we're creating a new step right in the middle of our list, then we might be actually putting a new code block right in the middle of a chapter. So anyways, it gets a little bit complex. That's a good question. What do I need to subscribe to in order to get advanced notice of these planned live sessions? You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can see how big of a novice I am. I'm still making this up. I believe that's how people are doing it. I've heard some people say that they're still not getting notified if you go to YouTube. We also send out our weekly newsletter, the one that had no subject, and we talk about it there. And I'm trying to do these regularly on every Wednesday. I think I'm going to switch that to Tuesday, but it's going to have a regular day and a regular time every week as well. So newsletter, YouTube subscription would be the best. Hopefully one of those will work. All right, I'm going to wrap up here in a second. Let's see what we get here. Oh, yeah, no, I got that. I thought I removed you. I did. Now it's coming from somewhere else. Tuts create, right? Are you even hitting this command? Am I calling the right code? No, I'm not. Why? Oh, duh. Ryan, there you go, buddy. Awesome. There we go. I have the version 1 and version 2 in a different directory, so I have to remember to actually call the right code. Newsletter is the SymfonyCast newsletter. So, boy, I'm embarrassed to say that that's not that easy to sign up for. The SymfonyCast newsletter, you can get it when you register. The normal little checkbox for newsletter. If you already have an account, then you can go into your profile and make sure you're subscribed there. And we promise next week I don't promise. Next week we'll hopefully have a subject line. All right, then we hit something called no tuts configuration found coming from chapter configuration. And I'm not going to get all the way through fixing this, but I'll kind of show you where the next step is that we're on. So this is coming from line 12. So this is a new class for version 2. And as its name sounds, it's all about trying to get the chapter configuration. And the chapter configuration is going to live in 2 parts. What you will see, what you're eventually going to see, the plan right now, I mean, if you imagine this is a tutorial, not TutsHero, then eventually what we're going to see is a file called, I can't remember, tutorial.json, I think. And this is going to contain all the chapters. Chapter 1, it's going to have information about chapter 1. I can't remember what information we're going to store. That's not JSON. And then inside of here, we're going to have all of the MD files. And then as soon as you start working with TutsHero, this metadata is effectively going to be copied into the .git directory of your project, because that's a nice internal spot that we can hide stuff. And then as we're like moving through and changing steps, it's actually going to be modifying the metadata inside of .git. And then ultimately when we compile, it will take that .git stuff and write it back to tutorial.json and those .md files. So I hope that was interesting. I knew that we weren't going to get through too much because it's really broken and really complex right now. But I'm really excited about this. And if you don't fully understand why version 2 is so much more exciting to me than version 1, that makes sense. The missing piece of this is, and I mentioned this maybe a month ago very briefly, we're also going to create a UI, an actual web UI for TutsHero version 2. Because ultimately what I want to do is effectively have an editor like this where I can just open up a .md file. Let's say I'm creating an asset mapper.md tutorial or asset mapper chapter. I want to basically be able to open this up. So this won't be inside of PHP Storm, but it'll be inside of a website, a web interface. And I want to just start kind of brainstorming here. What are we going to talk about? So we need, installing asset mapper. Okay, we're going to need to do that. And then maybe I don't know, changing app.js to console.log something, right? And when we do that, right there is where I'm going to be able to click a button that says something like add code. And behind the scenes, that will actually create a new step inside of TutsHero and check me out to that branch. And then I can flip over to PHP Storm, work on that change, commit that change, flip back to the UI, and suddenly we're going to see like the diff showing right inside of the editor right here. You can see like what changes I made to that file, and then I can keep going. And you can see it's really nice to have this in context, and that if I need to go back to this step, I'll just click back to that step. It's going to give us also hopefully some opportunities to do some AI stuff. In theory, if I create a code block, if I click that I want to create code inside of our tutorial, I might be able to give it a quick description like this. Hey, I'm going to change app.js to console.log hello. And maybe I can get a rough draft of what that change looks like within a few milliseconds, so that when I go over to my editor, I already have a draft version of that from AI, and then I can tweak it. Yeah, I think AI can also help us with our merge conflicts. It's kind of hard to explain, but when you create a tutorial, the types of merge conflicts you get are oftentimes very predictable. And as a human, it's not like merge conflicts in the real world, which can take all kinds of different shapes and sizes depending on what's happening. In tutorials, they're almost always this very predictable format where you renamed a variable before, and so that line conflicts on this new step as you're merging forward, but any human could tell you exactly how to fix that. So I'm hoping AI will also be able to fix those so that we can go backwards and then forwards again without kind of tripping over these merge conflicts over and over and over again. And then having everything inside the same file is going to give us other opportunities. It's going to hopefully streamline recording, et cetera, but that's so far down the line, I don't even have my mind wrapped around it. But this version 2 is kind of step 1. All right, that's it. I'm 5 minutes past. I've been kind of shooting for an hour so that you all don't have to listen to me too long. So I hope this was interesting. Thanks everyone for coming to hang out. Really appreciate the work that we did on the attributes. So I appreciate the feedback, ideas, brainstorming that everybody had on that. Next week, I think we're going to talk about Twig UI components. This is something I talked about sort of maybe a month ago. And this is something that is going to be, I think, heating up over the next few weeks. And what I'm talking about here is a site, probably on ux.symfony.com, to grab, I don't know what they're called yet, UI components or UI recipes. And we kind of bootstrapped something for this a couple weeks ago. Kevin has actually taken it further, actually taken in a totally different, better direction. But what we're talking about here is being able to say, you know, as a developer, I need a popover. Okay, so a place you can go on ux.symfony.com to get the HTML for a popover. The stimulus controller for a popover. For that popover. And if you're using it, the Twig components popover. So instead of just actually grabbing HTML, you'd actually be able to copy the HTML for a Twig component. So with these three things put together, you just grab the Twig component file, grab the stimulus controller, and boom, you can just paste that into your project and you have a working popover. And this isn't something that you would, it's not a package you would install, it's just something you would copy into your project. So this Twig components, you can then customize whatever CSS classes that you want inside of it. So I think this is going to be huge because when I'm building something, I do want those things. I need to get a popover. I need to get a modal. So what's the HTML for a modal? What's the stimulus controller I need for a modal? They're not hard stuff. Most of the HTML is very predictable. Looks about the same, minus classes being different for styling. And the stimulus controllers are often either already available as third-party stimulus controllers. You just need to know they exist. For example, there is a popover stimulus controller. And if there isn't a third-party controller and you need a custom controller, it's often really short. Maybe it's 10 lines of code. Maybe for a modal controller, that's a little bit more complicated. It's 40 lines of code. But even when it's 10 lines of code, you don't want to have to write that. There's no point to me writing that and you writing that and everyone else writing that over and over and over again. I want a place I can go just to grab the things, the common components that I need for my site. And this is not a new idea. It exists in other languages for React or Vue. And I'm thinking for Twig, this is not a hard problem. Like we deserve the same thing with Twig and Stimulus to get those things working on our site immediately. So next week, we're going to talk about this, probably build out one or a couple of these. Kind of see how it goes and talk maybe some strategy about that. All right, that's it. Thanks everybody. See you later. Good luck out there on the ski hills if you're skiing like we are. We're waiting for it to stop raining. And where am I? There we go. All right. Thanks everybody. I will see you hopefully next week or out on the internet. And if you ever have questions or anything, I'm also available on Slack. All right. Bye everybody.